Hello and welcome to the Get Lit Festival. I'm Kate Peterson, Director of Get Lit Programs, a nonprofit housed within Eastern Washington University. Get Lit is a week-long celebration of literature traditionally held in Spokane, Washington. To learn more about Get Lit, to find this year's schedule of events, or to donate, please click on the link below to visit our website, getlitfestival.org. Now I'd like to introduce Claire Walla, Get Lit's Assistant Coordinator.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you all for joining us. For this event, we're celebrating Eastern Washington University's Master of Fine Arts program in creative writing by featuring the talents of both current professors and program alums, all of whom will be reading from their work. In a discussion after the readings, our alumni and their former faculty advisors will discuss their experience creating a thesis, both in fiction and in poetry. Before we hand it off to Casey Guerin, who will be moderating this event, I'd like to give her a quick introduction. Casey Guerin earned her MFA from Eastern Washington University and her BA from Boston College. Originally from Cape Cod, she currently lives in Connecticut with her husband and daughter. Welcome, Casey.
Thank you, Claire. Thanks everyone for being here. We have 4 amazing readers for you tonight. We're going to have our 2 EWU professors, Gregory Spatz and Christopher Howell, and they'll be joined by their former students and advisees, Ashley Wurzbacher and Sunni Wilkinson. Each former student is going to read after their advisor, and then we'll end with a conversation with some of our audience members who may have some questions for them. We're grateful for everyone to be here and hope you're excited to join us. Let's go ahead and get started with our first reader. It's going to be Gregory Spatz. Gregory Spatz is the author of the collection of linked stories and novellas, What Could Be Saved, and of the novels Inukshuk, Fiddler's Dream, and No One But Us, and the short story collections Half is Happy and Wonderful Tricks. His stories have appeared in many publications, including The New Yorker, Glimmer Train Stories, Shenandoah, Epoch, Kenyon Review, and the New England Review. A recipient of the Mishner Fellowship, an Iowa Arts Fellowship, a Washington State Book Award, and an NEA Fellowship in Literature, he teaches at Eastern Washington University in Spokane.
Thanks, Casey. Let me apologize in advance before I get going there. Doing construction right out there. So if you hear like hammering as I'm reading, it's not me, it's not my computer, it's not your computer. It's the real world. So here goes. I'm going to start. I'll read you the beginning of a new short story called Break for Miracles. He would not be the first traveler to imagine his path through the mountains, rising and falling with the course of the river below, as a tunnel cut through space and time with everything along its course fated for him to encounter. The pattern of light and shadow on his windshield and on the road ahead, the exact smattering of rain at kilometer marker 146, wind gusting at the sides of his car, the sudden splat of a dead bug leaving Cranbrook and accelerating back to his normal cruising speed. Once you're underway, everything depends on the timing and execution of every antecedent choice and decision, and on the exact pressure through the ball of your foot against the gas pedal of the brake, and especially on your departure time. Leave a minute earlier. Don't get caught behind the red Suzuki with Manitoba plates creeping along exactly 5 clicks under the speed limit, and the rabbit suddenly dashing from the underbrush on your right won't tangle itself with your undercarriage. You won't get that sickening whack as it bumps under your tires, followed by the queasy apparition of writhing fur half stuck to the tarmac in your rearview mirror as you speed along your fated way. The ineffectual jerk through your wrists as you tried to dodge the critter, almost a memory, a blunt, bone-jarring alarm already fading as the road unwinds reassuringly ahead. But what were you supposed to do? Stay home? Never go anywhere? It was all set in motion the moment you left. Like everything in life, perpetual motion until it stops, only more obviously so. Less left to choice or free will, only remaining alert and awake, watchful of the dials, watchful of the side of the road for another rabbit or a deer or elk person. He was also not the first to realize that within this flying bubble of space so singularly isolated and confronted with fate, and therefore disconnected from the ordinary passage of time, the daily grind, a kind of pacific release and ecstasy was accessible, an opportunity to talk to yourself, babble in weird accents, engulf yourself in music echoing against the steel and glass. Why not? And for him, because of his lifelong dedication to music, not just as an enthusiast, fan, and listener, but as a professional, there's also an opportunity to practice and to reminisce, to lean into the pauses and dynamic swells, one hand or the other lifted to carve out signature metric shapes in the air, to cue the bassoons, the soloist, soften the strings, eyes and eyebrows straining to communicate, to drive them on wordlessly. Today it's Brahms's Third Symphony because it's what he grabbed on his way out the door, along with a new recording of Gesualdo madrigals he's been meaning to listen to for weeks now and somehow keeps forgetting. The radio reception is spotty, and anyway, who wants to hear more alarm and worry about the virus spreading in Wuhan, China, and the Americans gone crazy less than 100 miles south of where he's now driving as they try to impeach or protect the lunatic in charge? He can't keep current and does not want to keep current. Time for music. He doesn't, as he always imagines he will, slipping in a disc and waiting for the opening measures to well up excellently around his legs and across the dashboard, think much about his moments pre-performance and waiting off stage, or the pause as the lights dim before he strides into the spotlight, and the smattering sound of applause like rain, like butter in a pan, like nothing but itself really, and never the satisfying end or beginning to anything. You might hope it would be, as he plunges across the stage and onto the conductor's stand. Instead, with the start of the Allegro con brio, he's brought straight back in time through each theme's statement and development to some old sadness and former ideal of expression or embodiment of emotion that he had hoped to shape in the music and had had to eventually abandon. The orchestra he directs is the Okanagan Symphony Orchestra, after all, not the Philadelphia Philharmonic. And with that, with each recollected compromise, each less than perfect rendering, a reminder of real days surrounding those choices and all the poignancy of time past, all the little dramas and failures along the way. And because the subconscious mind is a tricky, subversive, but ultimately bald-faced saboteur in the ways it sends random rabbits across the roadways of conscious deliberation and choice, only now, as he wends his way out of Jaffrey into mountainous terrain and beyond the landscape that feels more familiar and like his own, does he realize why it was this particular piece, the Brahms, that he grabbed for the day's 9-hour drive. Of course, it's the one he threw himself into for healing and respite of some kind after Maxine, because, well, it was all he could do for a while. A good, hard piece to obsess over and be lost in, rather than think about her back out on the Gulf Islands with her half-bear of a husband and their wild brood, her practicing for whatever string of upcoming engagements with regional symphonies was next on her schedule, the traveling soprano, emailing with him and calling sporadically, elliptically, and finally going silent for weeks at a time. Would he ever see her again? Unclear then. But before that, before the fizzling and uncertainty and the silence that had pushed him ever deeper into Brahms, they'd driven this exact route together. He was much cleverer then and had managed to clear things last minute in such a way so that he could be her driver and assistant after her engagements with the OSO. So they could extend their few nights together in Kelowna into a week and a half, traveling southeast and north until he dropped her at the Calgary airport and headed home again. The long, heartbroken drive home, listening to her recordings all the way. He'd been so foolishly full of hope then, confident and certain of some future following her around in other provinces and states. Idiot. So he's surprised and not surprised outside Fernie when the young woman materializes at the side of the road in a sudden stripe of sunlight like weather detached from earlier in the winter and stranded around her so she has to raise a hand over her eyes visor-like to see his approach. Girl, he thinks. Not a girl, he corrects himself, a young woman in her 20s. Though, to be fair, at this phase of his life, approaching 70, everyone under the age of 40 seems happily and similarly childlike to him, convinced still of their immortality and of the drama of self-purpose, self-definition, self-direction, following them everywhere like a silent film crew recording and tracking their every move through the dull passage of days. No awareness yet of how fleeting and random it all might be. The mossy green muslin of her scarf is familiar, and the dyed bright red of her hair in contrast with that green pulled to her chin against the wind, not quite covering her cheek. He's almost beside her when he sees the violin case angled against her leg. a ratty knapsack on her shoulder, and by then the choice that was already half made feels fully made and almost beyond his control. Who, he thinks, a violinist? Even as he's already pulling over, signal chiming, rumble strip rattling under his tires, and tires sending up a spray of gravel and dust as he brakes from 120 kilometers per hour to 0 and starts zigging back up the shoulder toward her. The situation is surprising because almost no one hitchhikes anymore, but also not surprising because he'd been thinking about Maxine enough that it feels as if her absence and the loneliness surrounding it may have somehow caused this woman's sudden appearance. Total bullshit, he knows, of course, but not. Anyway, his thoughts have primed him to expect her. So, sure, he'll be the one to pull over and give her a lift, like he was the one to hit that rabbit. He tries to imagine whether or not he really saw the bits of fluff and hair pulling themselves back from the tarmac and sprinting the rest of the way across the road, or just wished for it. Hey, she says, leaning in the open door. There's something weird about her voice, a strained quality like undertones and overtones pushing through and against one another like rocks, or an excess of breath caught in her larynx, which is at odds with the openness of her face. Only going as far as Fort McLeod, he says up at her. Will that help? Yes, it will. There's a smell as she swings stiffly into the seat beside him. Musty, unwashed skin, a little cloying, hair, clove cigarettes, wind, bacon, body odor. All of this and other elements of her life on the road imbued in the threads of her clothes unwashed for long enough that the corona of smells is indistinct as it once unplaceable, stomach-turning, and familiar to him. It's very nice of you to stop, she says. I'm on my way to Edmonton. It's like she's whispering. Mocking him, but why? Despite his reservations and the strangeness of her voice and smell, or maybe because of these things, because he wants to prove to himself his willingness to take chances, be accepting in the intersection of fate and need and strangeness and generosity, he finds himself nodding his head, bobbing it up and down like it's come unattached from his neck. All righty then, he says, off we go. She leans for the door, her stuff she's slung into the seat well between her feet. Violin, green nylon knapsack seems unlikely to him somehow, discouragingly detached from her as if it's not quite hers, so he has to wonder a moment about this choice, though really it's already too late. Is it hers at all? Does she play? Is she a comrade in need after all? The light shifts from brilliant to shadowed, clouds speeding by overhead, a gust of wind flattening the trees at the side of the road. He's momentarily glad for the small rituals of re-beginning travel and self-conscious about his old mannish mannerisms as he does, as he flips down the turn signal, studies his side view mirror and rear view to be doubly sure, eases off the brake, makes a humming noise as he continues watching for other cars and pulls back into the lane for travel. He is no longer on the same trip, he realizes. This was his choice. But the rest of the drive, for better or worse, until he drops her off, will be altered, while everything outside the car probably remains exactly as it was and as it was fated to be. Seatbelt, he says, glancing once at her as the alarm begins its delayed chiming. Then Marcus, a hand extended for her to shake. The edges of her fingerless gloves feel crusty and soft against his skin, threads rimmed with food or snot or some other effluvia. Georgia. And at once he understands. He glances again as the scarf falls away to confirm it. The voice is not a female voice. Basso profundo, resonant, deeper than his own and matched with a prominent Adam's apple, the ledge of which bobs once and again as she swallows and continues speaking. So grateful you were willing to stop, Marcus. These days, no one trusts anymore. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Greg. Now we're going to hear from Greg's former advisee, Ashley Wurzbacher. Ashley Wurzbacher's writing has appeared in the Iowa Review, the Kenyon Review, Prairie Schooner, the Cincinnati Review, Colorado Review, Michigan Quarterly Review, Gettysburg Review, Alaska Quarterly Review, and elsewhere. She earned her MFA from Eastern Washington University and her PhD in Literature and Creative Writing from the University of Houston. Originally from Titusville, Pennsylvania, she currently lives in Birmingham, Alabama, and teaches creative writing at the University of Montevallo. Her debut short story collection, Happy Like This, is the winner of the 2019 John Simmons Iowa Short Fiction Award, a National Book Foundation 5 Under 5 honoree, and a New York Times Editor's Choice. Ashley, take it away.
Thanks, Casey. I'm going to read the beginning of a story called Make Yourself at Home, which is from my book. And it's partly an epistolary story, so there are a couple of letters in it. And hopefully, I don't know, you'll catch the difference between the narration and the letters, which is clearer on the page than in the voice, maybe. So make yourself at home. Anyway, the address on the package was her own, at least for now, even if the name was not. Surely that made opening it less dishonest. Caroline knew better, knew the box was none of her business. Still, she found that her hands folded back its cardboard flaps and sifted through tissue like two ill-behaved friends whose peer pressure she was incapable of resisting. Her hands located the shape of something hard, ceramic, and fractured. A blue bowl, a broken blue bowl not meant for her. Caroline knew the responsible thing would have been to leave the box for Meredith's return or forward it on to Boston to its rightful owner, Meredith, under bright lights, trying on wedding gowns. No questions asked. She pictured Meredith times 3 or 4, multiplied in the mirrors of a boutique fitting room, turning to evaluate from all angles the flattery of the cut and the fabric. Everything in the world to be gained, or else gained already. Caroline pulled each chip of the ceramic bowl from the box with care and assembled them on the table. Then she searched every drawer in Meredith's apartment for glue. When Meredith had left the apartment, heading to Boston to spend the next 3 months with her new fiancé, a law student at BU, she'd taken with her all the belongings she could fit into 2 suitcases and left the rest behind. She'd shoved aside the clothes that still hung in her walk-in closet to clear space for Caroline's and told her to make herself at home. It had been challenging at first. Meredith, an old college classmate of Caroline's, kept her apartment bejeweled with framed photographs of herself that seemed to stare at Caroline as if waiting for the answer to some unasked but urgent question. On the day she left, Meredith had handed Caroline the keys, shown her how to jiggle open the lock on the front gate, and instructed her to place fresh bay leaves by pipes and drains to keep roaches away. But she had neglected to arrange to have her mail forwarded. Everyone who knows me knows where I am, she'd said when Caroline called her after a few days of receiving her Victoria's Secret catalogs. Just throw whatever comes in a pile. I'll deal with it when I get back, she'd instructed. Less than a week later, the package arrived. It came from North Dakota, and what made it so irresistible was the fact that, although their addresses were different, the receiver's name at the center of the box, Meredith's, and the sender's name in the upper corner were exactly the same, down to the letter, even the uncommon Polish surname with its many consonants and single vowel stuck among them as if the name were a child's puzzle. Which of these letters is not like the others? Which one does not belong? Inside the box, among the fragments of pottery, was an envelope, to Meredith from Meredith, which Caroline now turned over in her hand and slid her finger under the edge of the flap and tore. Before coming to Meredith's, she'd been living alone in a house on a country road outside Fort Collins, a rental surrounded by pines, set away from the commotion of the university where she'd studied and where she still worked. The house sat against a hill where a mountain lion ranged, sometimes screaming at night like a woman being stabbed. Otherwise, it was silent, and since her father's death, Caroline had taken to leaving the radio on all day for the noise. She listened to conspiracy theories, depressing stories about civil unrest, uplifting stories about cancer survivors, strange stories about spontaneous order, bioluminescence, conjoined twins fused at the hip or sharing a common heart. But in Denver, she had no use for a radio. There was the noise of the building's tenants, the clamor of the street, other people's doors opening and closing. It was less possible there to forget you were in the world. She had come to the city for a change of scene in the wake of her father's death. She would spend late summer and autumn at Meredith's, an hour and a half from home, close enough that she could run back if necessary, far enough away to feel fresh and strange. subletting while her father's house sat empty. It had been Fat Man who'd told her, "You've got to get away, kid." He'd been kind enough to grant her a leave of absence for the fall. And why not? She was replaceable. Grad students would do her work while she was gone. She'd compose a draft of Fat Man's next article from afar, and as usual, he'd be first author of all her published words. Caroline was a detail. She was et al. During her father's last months, she told herself it was only the stress of his sickness that was keeping her from quitting her job as a lab manager for her former advisor and moving on. But now, supergluing the shards of Meredith's blue bowl, watching two sisters approach the apartment building and step from her window, left, right, as if one was a body and the other a mirror, she understood that this had been a lie. She had become the ugly stepchild of her department, the hanger-on, the petrification, and it was her own fault. Some people got married, some people had babies, some people went to work in power suits or got fancy industry jobs or tenure. Caroline simply held on, and barely. Fat Man, the title was more of statement of fact than of judgment or malice, got the grant money, credit for the publications. Caroline was Skinny Man, responsible for groundwork, as much a mechanic as a researcher, passing on data, running around haggard. She had finished her PhD in plant physiology 3 years ago, and now here she was in the same department at the same university, labeling plastic bags, surrounded by pruning shears and chainsaws, calibrating pressure bombs, measuring chemical concentrations in leaves. She kept a sleeping bag rolled in the space underneath her desk on campus, a flaccid pillow and travel-sized toothbrush in a drawer. She was her own handyman and her own housewife, and it wasn't the job itself she was unhappy with. It wasn't her life necessarily. It was just the sense of stagnation, the running in a circle, gathering things she felt always about to drop. Her friend Paula, whose dissertation was considered more significant than Caroline's, had just snagged a Forest Service job in an industry with low turnover rates, run by men who didn't let go of their posts until they had to, men who died in the saddle, so to speak. She had removed her things from the office she shared with Caroline just a few days before Caroline left for the fall. "It'll happen for you, Caro," Paula had said, leaning over Caroline's shoulder while she mounted cores on pieces of wood and measured their rings under a microscope. "You know how it is. It's all just waiting around for some old white guy to die, and they do eventually." "Ha," Caroline said. She had imagined that in the city she'd be different, more like Meredith maybe, zipping around in taxis, wearing heels. She'd become a coffee drinker, maybe adopt a cat. But already a week in, the late summer scorching too early the leaves on the trees, a premature autumn, she'd settled into lethargy, hair unwashed, wearing mismatched socks, opening somebody else's mail. Was she nothing without someone to take care of? Meredith. I Googled myself yesterday and was surprised to find I was not the only me. I know this might be creepy, but I saw you were getting married, saw your online registry, and wanted to send a gift. I found your address in a web database. Hope you're not too freaked out, 1, that I'm out here, and 2, that I found you. I'm 27 and recently out of rehab the second time, trying to stay clean. We'll see how it goes this time around. I'm working on getting back in touch with myself, you might say. I got toxic things inside me I need to let out. I live in North Dakota and work in a restaurant and am an artist. I'm sending you this bowl I made and wishes for your wedding and a happy future. No need to write back. I bet you're busy, but for some reason it's a comfort to know you're out there, like discovering a long-lost twin, even though I'm sure you're not much like me. But it's not like we're both named Jane Doe or John Smith. I always thought I was so unique and so alone. I suppose names are just outside things like coats of paint or glaze. Besides, you'll probably be changing yours soon, and then it'll be just me again. I don't know. What do you think? I hope you like the bowl. Take care, Meredith. Caroline set the letter on the table, flushed with the sense of having irreversibly committed to something large. To ignore the letter seemed cruel. Meredith was an addict, after all, or had been. She needed support. Caroline sat for a while at the kitchen table where the reassembled bowl sat healing, glue drying. She had seen the letters MP scrawled in the unglazed clay of its base. It was probably cold in North Dakota, even in summer. Caroline had never known anyone who'd lived there or imagined that anyone actually did. She pictured Meredith, the new one, in sturdy boots on a farm, face a hazy blur like something censored. In the morning, she milks cows, and the raw milk in the bucket is swirled pink with blood. She lights a cigarette. No, only considers it in a fleeting moment of weakness. She stuck a nicotine patch on her arm, another attempt at wellness. Her pottery studio is a small, cold lean-to on the side of the barn. She sits down at the wheel, blowing puffs of moist air onto her thin fingers, and throws down a chunk of clay the size of a softball. She watches it spin, an urge to use whatever it was she'd been using, and she rolls the impulse off with a shiver, plunges wet hands into the clay. The slip gathers under her nails. She does this because she loves it, because she's cleanest when her hands are this particular type of dirty. She does it so as not to do something else. You couldn't just leave someone out there like that. Caroline dug through Meredith's desk, Meredith of the wedding gowns and the many self-portraits, for paper. Dear Meredith, thank you for your note and for the bowl. I have filled it with strawberries and it has brought a cheerful splash of color to my kitchen. My fiance and I are house hunting, and when we find one, we plan to paint the walls cornflower blue. It's as if you knew this somehow. He is an entomologist, and for our honeymoon, we will travel to Malaysia to watch thousands of rare fireflies flash in unison in a forest of mangroves. He studies insects and I study trees. We're a natural pair, I suppose. We met in Banff, researching. I sincerely wish you the best of luck in your rehabilitation. I myself have had a positive experience with recovery recently. My father has survived cancer. Last year, there was a tumor the size of a golf ball in his lung, and this year he's up and about and currently hiking the Continental Divide Trail. Am sending you positive energy. Positive energy? What was that? A cheerful splash of color? Who was the writer of this letter? Not Meredith, certainly, but not quite Caroline either. There was no fiance, for instance, and there had been no tumor, and of course there was no hiking the Continental Divide Trail. Though the thought of it made Caroline smile, her father tearing open a bag of granola with his teeth. Except he wouldn't have eaten granola. Too hippie, too green. Homemade jerky, probably, sliced along the grain and dried in the oven with the door cracked, and not too good in all honesty, marinated too much or too little. And he didn't have cancer. He died of a neurodegenerative genetic disorder, and it still was, terrible. Shortly before his death, Caroline had gone alone to the hospital to be tested for the gene that caused the disease. The results were negative, so she was in it for the long haul with herself, and she was supposed to be happy about it. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Ashley. We're going to switch genres now and hear some poetry. First, from Professor Christopher Howell. Born in Portland, Oregon, Christopher Howell is author of a dozen poetry collections, including The Grief of a Happy Life, Love's Last Number, Gaze, and Dreamless Impossible, Poems New and Selected. He has received numerous honors, including the Washington State Book Award, fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Artist Trust, and 3 Pulitzer Prizes, Pushcart Prizes. 3 Pulitzer Prizes would be very impressive. There's still time. A military journalist during the Vietnam War, he has been for many years director and principal editor for Lynx House Press and lives in Spokane, Washington. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. All right. I'll read a few poems from this recent book and then I'll read some new pieces. This is called Canticle of Gilgamesh, Returned from Heaven. As Enkidu came down from the mountain, so the sky accepts us, whichever way we fall. New sky will spread its tresses, an unknown and not known truth, a known and not known truth, as the beasts know nothing of our names. Enkidu was the name of a man of ripe pears. One life will lay no finger to his dancing. It may step and turn all its days at the gate and not pass through this truth without wings and nothing for a brother and no one for a soul except the one life's locket with its secret key of grass. Shocking that the one life comes only once in Kaidu, beautiful brother who drinks the heart's dark water, who takes amber for his meat and is a lamp to which the one life turns as to the sun, though as to the sun, who can say the truth of that almost mortal fire so long and bright? Forgive me, I am nothing like the king or the king's messenger. I am the one without plight or vengeance in Kaidu. I am the one question walking the one path. This is called Another Crossing. It was the river of death, and we crossed it, or the river of forgetting, which is why I don't remember crossing it. Holding your hand as we were reborn, strangers to every river and ourselves, flyaway spirits whose bodies were dreaming. Love was not our number, and the days, if they were days, were like any dark limb or whistle, any momentary singing from the back room of an old hotel where no one sat at the bar with no one else, carving in dust the signals of our disappearance. What is a wound if not this, crossing under the moonlight eyes of the boatman who has waited among the willows all these years, sad king of patience, old blue fire of human things, last things, beauty itself, bent to its oars inside us. And so I've been teaching this course in the Surrealist movement in poetry, and I just gave the students an assignment to write as though they were members of the Surrealist group and they were kind of bidding goodbye to Surrealism. And I have a sort of a poem that maybe fits that assignment, but it's really a goodbye to a Surrealist. The fantastic, original, and outrageous Adam Hammer. A letter to Adam Hammer, the last true Surrealist. I remember your poem that mentions a who's who among the dead, and now you are among them these 30 years and more, and are no doubt included in its pages. Pity you had to wait for fame so long. I would like to tell you how things are now at my level of animate being, but given your imagination, it is doubtful I can supply much surprise. Generally, the living celebrate and suffer as expected. Some of it, though, like our criminally ridiculous president, is too strange to confess, even to the dead. And of course, why would you care? I should report I married a woman too good for me, as you might have predicted, and all these years now have been gainfully employed, which you would also have bet on, I suppose. I'm writing now to tell you sometimes when confronted with terminal oddities, a cat wearing a helmet or a door made out of cake, I think you are nearby enjoying it right now. 13 quail are dipping and pecking in unison outside my window, and I imagine you supposing they might be trained to samba or blow smoke rings in reverse. I'm on an island again, temporarily, and soft rain is blowing in off the sea. Every hour or so, one of those huge ferry boats slides by. What if they are from or bound for a world in which you are possible again, and violently happy, maybe at work on a poem in which all the castanets and stained glass marine mammals in existence unionize and demand acting lessons, and xylophones become quilts. I hold out my hat to you, and my hands, which are now a little twisted from having to remember so many shapes, so much soup and handball and kindling. I draw a map of your eye as I remember it, refusing to wink or announce what might have been your mind's virtual whereabouts. I hold out 6 black stones picked up in front of the house on Vashon because something seemed to have been written on them, something hilarious if I could just put on that eye of yours and read it. No doubt it has to do with love and death, their alternating ease and maddening Fred Astaire-like balance. No doubt something like Time's half-blind mermaid school marm placed it there, thinking of you on your way to the principal's office again, innocent as a sailor on leave, and leading a rhinoceros on a long strand of homemade spaghetti. So, expurgated scene. The king's fool said no, and they looked at him as if he were a door that opened, slammed, and excused itself. The physician and the astrologer writhed with embarrassment. The queen took a finger load of snuff and requested more music. Rain fell in hogsheads from a cloudless sky. Larks went up in flame. What the deuce do you mean, no? Asked the king's red face. And the fool said, no one of you will ever know the sheer brazen satisfaction of authoring an unexpected moment, which is the fool's prerogative, and in which lies also his only gladness and revenge. And they had him lashed to a spit and roasted while he laughed, his buttons popping off one by one, all except the very last, which unexpectedly turned to steam. A contingency. In the dream of the old schoolmaker, in the dream of the old shoemaker, Edgar Allan Poe is crossing an Inca bridge, blindfolded, a little high, perhaps literally, for once, 1,000 feet below, water white as the jaguar's tooth, roars as though hungry. The half-rotted planks of the bridge buckle and sway, and Poe smiles with terrified appreciation, counting each step as death defeated one more time and celebrated by a harsh tonic note in the heavens and all through the rock-strewn altiplano, where the shoemaker finds suddenly himself seated before an enormous crystal cobbler's last, hammering Poe's face into a ballet slipper with a small mustache. God be praised, he says, in case this is neither his dream nor someone else's. Someone singing. My father and uncle poured cement for the foundation and basement walls of the new addition. Not enough mud for the floor, they said, standing, shaking their heads. It was the gray of elephants and smooth when the forms came off. My cousin and I drew faces on it in colored chalk. I drew an owl and a lantern, and it rained. They put a tarp over the stack of lumber, sweet smelling, and so unlike the garage, which smelled of dust and old bicycles that had seemed to have wandered in there on their own. My mother hummed as she removed strange, tiny clothing from the cedar chest. Why did we need an extra room? My grandparents spoke in Danish about this. They were like the movies, or something dreamed and half sunlit under a bridge. In the background, I could still hear the hammering and my uncle saying, "Looks good, just like that." Tools, a faded green Buick that had become a tractor, laundry embracing the breeze, chickens, cats, the next door neighbor's duck that chased our dog and the mailman, time like a lily that would never die, wind in the poplars, windows darkening toward bedtime, someone singing, stars. Dolphinology. Dolphins can walk on their tails, apparently. Whether this is part of a mating ritual or just ordinary showing off is a matter of some debate among dolphinologists. Most of them, and myself too, in an amateur sort of way, have tried walking on their tails and have found it ticklish and unrewarding. Dolphins are said to be smart, but when I tried walking on my tail, and over water no less, I felt stupid. Though stupidity itself is something of a mystery. I'm not interested. Who cares? There's a theory that dolphins walk on their tails because they're trying to grow feet, which could be good, I guess. Then they could walk around among us on sidewalks and at cocktail parties. Maybe they could then grow arms and learn to smoke. Smoking dolphins sounds like an exclamation. Smoking dolphins, that guy's tall, but I bet he can't walk on his tail. A couple of more here. Hanshan. Who has counted pennies of the last hour spending itself or counted his footsteps climbing the mountain? So many stars to make a mystery when one would be enough. Having risen in the dark at 5 a.m. The truth of a person may be incidental, fragmentary, lost in the accuracy of specific spillways and rooms. And beyond, there is an early dark with its animals, lamps pretending to be candles, lonely and unseen patches of grass. Parsing nature's truth from ours is never easy as lifting an arm or a cup, never as free as waking without thought in what could easily be St. Louis or San Juan or an unnamed planet among the impossibly distant stars. Nothing holds true but the mystery of moments, one's own mind peeling back their husks and shells, rocking in the wind's current, the names of God like plants, surprised by light on a windowsill. Summer in 3 parts. Just pause between them. Old man on a porch in sunlight. In his mind, lobsters loll at an edge of the sea where there will be no singing as the moon comes up, if it ever does. Again, the lobsters think, delicately moving their spoons, dreaming reluctantly of days that will not come and the twisted and beautiful underwater trees in blossom. All alone in the breakfast room, expensive crockery, cringing but arrogant on the plate rail and behind the glittering leaded glass cabinet doors with their tarnished brass fixtures longing for the housemaid's ministrations, sunlight walks the hours slowly across the faded Moroccan rug with a closed eye in the middle of it. Old man on the porch in sunlight and a breeze soft as its voice in the grass. He imagines death as an old gray horse bending to drink from a stream and being careful not to step on the frogs. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. And now we'll hear from our final reader, Sunni Brown Wilkinson. Sunni Brown Wilkinson's poetry can be found in Western Humanities Review, Sugar House Review, Hayden's Ferry Review, Swim, Ruminate, Body, and other journals and anthologies. She's the author of The Marriage of the Moon and the Field and The Ache in the Wing, which is forthcoming this June as winner of the Sundresses 2020 Chapbook Prize. Her poetry has also been awarded New Ohio Review's Norword Poetry Prize and the 2020 Joy Harjo Prize from Cutthroat Literary Magazine. She teaches at Weber State University and lives in northern Utah with her husband and 3 sons.
Thank you so much. I'm going to read a few poems from The Marriage of the Moon and the Field, and then I have one new one that I wanted to share. It's a fairly broad collection. Overall, it's mainly poems about the marriage of this world and then the possibility of another world, the world that we don't see, maybe the world we go to when we're done in this world. So there's a lot of sort of back and forth between this world and another world. And I selected poems that tend to revolve in some way around the seasons. So I will start with one called Autobiography with Birds. Willow Park shrouded in a dust that hushed the monkeys. I heard the peacocks shuffle their wild feathers, their tiny fires of noise like flamenco's castanets. Our family's pet parrot learned to cry like my brother Riley. Even when Riley was gone, we heard him crying all through the house. Haircuts on the back porch and towels around our shoulders, ears glistening. 1 month later, robin's nest rimmed with fine white hair. After winter, my father pruned the Macintosh the sparrows loved. They're chittering high up like children playing house in a world of trees. In the years of aloneness, my unborn children came, diving, drinking summer's sweet dark under the bridge. I mistook them for swallows. Fireweed, bicycle, Alaska. That summer, the terns haunted one curve in a gravel path, a nest in the rocks, and a mother fighting for all her lives. September, my son and I bury the limp finch in a shoebox filled with black-eyed Susans. We cradle its head a moment before the darkness comes. There's also motherhood that's threaded throughout quite a few of the poems. This one is called Butter on the Bread and Honey on the Butter. There's an engine in the garden this morning, chugging from yarrow to cosmos. That beggar of blossoms carries a dagger, and all his sugar's the aftermath of spit. Later, the baby's foot finds him in the grass, and the wailing starts, high and thin, until we bring the cut onion to cool it out of pain. It's a trick. What makes you cry under the knife is also a balm, like each child I have borne. On the field trip to the Pioneer Farm, kids crowd the kitchen for a chance to churn butter. The girl in the blue apron wears her hair in 2 braids and upbraids the kids like a mother for not raising their hands. My son has just milked a cow, slid his hands over that strange balloon that fills with milk slowly from a place we can't see. He is a room with 1 bright window. He was the first to make honey in my breast. The baby roots the moment he wakes, turning his face to whatever moves him. Flanked by his cries, I lift the t-shirt, everything in the way of the breast that opens itself like a flower. There are days the bee comes sharply and the sugar hardens in the dark cupboard. Then I call myself honey, take me gently by the hand. Like bread, I'm practiced in the art of rising. Like my son, I'm hungry for what I don't have. Jesus called death the sting, and we understand. After he raised the dead, what would they eat, the body and the spirit fresh with empty? The good bread of the house, of course, and something on top. They ate their way back to a consolable hunger, like a baby, back to the rooting that loosens the clutch. In the end of the mouth, it's the tongue searching, the tongue that finds what's sweet. This is more an autumn poem. And the title bridges into the rest of the poem. At last, the light in the trees wavers and moves on like an old woman turning away from the mirror. Everything dims. Now the lamp is master. November, and the rake face down in a pile of leaves is like a kid playing dead, the stick of his back staying perfectly still. And at night, in our bed, the bird of me returns to the tree of you. All we've shed, leaves and feathers on the floor. The dark and your limbs draw me in. I'll sing now in my little house of bones. My son says he has an owl inside of him, soft, with large, sad eyes. The snow has not stopped falling all morning, and I am pregnant, and the baby is soft and has eyes we can't see. In the garden, white slowly smothers the flowers, lights lining the walk, the goosenecked gas meter ugly in its protrusion, gone. What falls now remakes the world. Inside me, an orchid unwraps itself. In the exam room, on the black and white screen, particles swirl around the child. What will he find when he comes? Was it worth the work of making himself? Loose matter gathers around and inside him, a snow globe settling. Even when the doctor turns off the screen, prints the images, something falls into place, something crouches, unwinds, prepares to fly. All day I wonder if the world is enough. Pieces of light fall endlessly. The owls inside us open their wide eyes. I'll do one more from the book. And I think you got a little concert from my parakeets. So I hope they're not too loud. Okay. Little owl in a dark room, singing hoo, hoo, and the creaks of the old crib as he lifts himself up. Summer in the covers and fall around the house. Stillness. Now, hoo, hoo, and ba, ba, ba. In the oldest language, he lifts the morning over our heads. The ceiling tilts as I rise, cold wood like a river under my feet. And I'll just pull up a new one. It's called April 23rd, 2020, and today is Shakespeare's birthday. And it's raining, a grand gray opening to the day, the bucolic dramas unfolding in the grass, in the nest, in our own humming houses. Another friend's heart broken, and star-crossed trees throw their white confetti over the budding peonies. All of us are masked now, playing a part, not quite sure of our lines, but the rhythm, like our heartbeats, leads us on. All the world's a stage, and the play must go on despite fresh graves, all the Yoriks we have loved, the great monologue of death rolling through the evening news, armies of us lurching to the store, to Home Depot, lost but gathering seeds, flowers like Ophelia, daisies for innocence we've lost, violets for our faithfulness in dark times, rosemary for remembrance of what we once were, still want to be. At the throne, our own mad king, a Lear still loving the wrong daughters, the crude threatening tirades, and yet life is still a miracle. Here on my lawn, quail chase through wet grass. Rock cress flaunts its yellow stockings. Morning doves sing life's a tragedy, but all day long the swallows peer in our windows and we laugh with our children again, spend all day petting the dog. The fog moves in and the rain falls like a curtain on a play. We're still naming. If we're lucky, this one's about redemption.
Thank you, Sunny. Thank you all so much. It was great to hear everyone read. I want to ask a couple of questions and get the conversation started about the MFA thesis process and what it's like to work on a manuscript with a professional mentor and mentee. I want to start with a question that's for Greg and Chris. What to you is special about this relationship between a mentor and a mentee, both during the thesis process when you're working with each other more intently and after, when you kind of have, you're no longer in the MFA program, you're advisee, but you still kept connected? So either one can go first if you want.
You want me to go first? It's hard to say that there's any one thing that's special about it. I mean, it's all kind of special and it's all always sort of different. I think I work with my students kind of differently than Chris does. It's pretty self-paced. So I'm letting students kind of discover their own process. I mean, part of it is like, I want them to be developing the habits that will sustain their work once they're done with the degree. And and I don't like to impose a lot of deadlines because that's not what you get in the real world. But I do want them to have the sense that, there's an attentive audience, there's someone who's ready to read stuff and be, as critical as I can be, line edits, suggestions for what to do with it. And it's really exciting, in Ashley's case, I'm trying to remember, it's been a long time ago, but, there were some stories that were like, this is done. This is great. It was really exciting to just read it and like, that's great. I love this story. Here's a couple little things you could do with it. But, and then there was one story I think that kept kind of cycling back around that, like flying people in it and birds that were falling out of the sky. And that one was like it was kind of a story that she was like, I don't know, just sort of worrying over a lot and doing a lot of stuff too. And that one ended up being very different and is part of the book, I think, right? In a really, really different form. But, and other ones that I had thought were like, that's great, it's done, send it out. They're not in the book. So, I don't know. And, so for everyone that I work with, it's kind of a little bit different, but there's a different sort of relationship that starts to be formed in that process, because you're just working more closely on the page. And in some cases, like in Ashley's case, it continues afterwards so that, I still see stuff of hers, and we share work, which is, that's a rarity, I think. That's not how it goes with most students. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that's great. Thank you. Chris, what do you think?
I suppose it's true that my process with thesis students may be somewhat different, but I agree with Greg that part of it is a sort of modeling for how you go forward, with the rest of your writing life, which we hope always is the rest of one's actual life. I mean, the real success, it seems to me, that you want to encourage is for the student to go on, to continue to write, no matter what, to continue to do it, to take that kind of risk, which is both intellectual and emotional, and transform it into these moments, which go forward again, kind of on their own, into the literary future. I do a lot of line editing, and it's sort of modeling a certain kind of editing that I think is essential for the poet. And it requires a way of differentiating oneself from whatever intention might have spurred the poem, and to see not what you intended, but what you actually said, and to know the difference, and to know that there's real potential in that difference, right? So there's a whole lot of very hands-on kind of editorial discussion, and what I feel about the result is that you become part of the student's cohort going forward into her or his career. It is a relationship that continues. I'm perfectly open to that, and I assume it and expect it, and the same kind of open-handed treatment was offered to me as a graduate student, and it meant a lot to me, right up till the time when my advisor, passed on. So, I've always been happy to be part of the program, and continue to deal with students, and I'm really happy that I'm still in touch with so many of them, and that they feel like they can be in touch with me and use me as a resource. Does that answer?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Chris.
You betcha.
Kind of along the same lines for Ashley and Sunny, what do you recall about working with your two advisors who are here, and what's something valuable you learned from them that you still take with you, or kind of when you're at the desk or at the page is in the back of your mind, you can hear their voice kind of still with you forever? Ashley, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I would really say that I definitely consider Greg to be a large part of my target audience. Like when I'm writing something, and I will ask myself, like, would Greg like this? Not only because he's a person I respect, but also because he's a person who cares about sentences and the beauty of language. And so yeah, I definitely feel like, I'm very fortunate that we do exchange work. So very often he is looking at works in progress, but even when he isn't, like, he sort of indirectly is, because I do think about, like, I consider him an important part of my audience. And yeah, I would, like, Greg mentioned something earlier about wanting his students and advisees to develop habits that they take with them after the program ends. And I think that was something really important that Greg did for me, and that I think is important for all graduate students, because, while you're in this sort of safe, supportive environment of a program where you do have deadlines, even if they are kind of loose, and you do have a captive audience for your work, like it's easy to be sort of lazy, and important to find a way to be a writer apart from the safety of that environment and the deadlines and the captive audience. And so, like, I remember Greg saying to me at a party around the time that I graduated from the program, like, you know, you really better keep writing. Like, I think he was like hoping that I would and thought that I would, but was also a little bit worried that I wouldn't. And that stayed with me too. And sometimes if I do feel sort of lazy or like it's hard to self-motivate, I kind of remember that moment. And like, yeah, I continue to have an interesting mix of like a desperation to not disappoint Greg as my mentor. And also, like, over the years, I've developed, you know, my own sort of style and voice. And like, you know, for example, there's this story in my collection about a mermaid. And Greg had also, around the same time, happened to write a story about a mermaid. And we exchanged our mermaid stories and, you know, gave each other feedback. And like, Greg did not love my mermaid story. And he actually suggested that I remove it from the collection. And I had to decide that I was not going to listen to him, which was hard because I'm very much like a person who wants to please the people that they love. But I just felt like it belonged there. And it's a story that I think a lot of readers do love, even if it wasn't Greg's cup of tea. And so I feel like I'm always kind of balancing like the part of me that just wants to like get my A and the part of me that needs to be more independent and who has developed those habits that Greg was talking about and can, you know, make my own decisions about my work and how I want to present it to the world.
Thanks. Yeah, that sounds like a good habit to have formed, even if it inadvertently went against Greg in the end with your mermaid story. Sunny, what about you?
I will say there's someone at my door. I remember very distinctly that there was a point it was probably just after my first year of the program, and I wasn't sure if I was doing a good enough job. I wasn't sure where I was at, and I don't even know if Chris will remember this, but I went to his office to talk to him, and he didn't know why I was there. Before I could say anything, he just said, "Oh, wow, you have just this really old voice in your poetry, and it's different from everyone else's." And before I could melt down and say, "I don't know if I'm good enough," I thought, "Oh my gosh, maybe I'm okay." And we sat down and had a really good talk after that. And I thought, I think I'm going to be able to stick with this. I think I can stick it out. So I feel like that's one of the core attributes that Chris has that's helped me, is that he affirmed that I actually have something valuable to share when I wasn't quite sure. The other part is, I remember in that discussion in his office, he said, I said, I don't know if I want to teach in academia one day. I do end up doing that now, but I said, I don't know what I want to do. And he said, well, what do you want to do, Ben? And I said something like, make furniture. And he said, well, then make furniture, but keep writing. It doesn't matter what your day job is, just keep writing. And that is probably the single best piece of advice I have ever gotten. Because I mean, there was a time in my life where I have 3 little boys, and I was swimming in babies at some point, and I felt like my whole day was macaroni and cheese and Play-Doh and nothing that was really like sexy or romantic or poetry related. But I just kept writing, and I don't think I was even writing decent stuff at that point. I was just writing to keep writing. But periodically I'd check in with Chris, and then when I started to get my manuscript put together, and I sent it to him, and he wrote back, and I don't know, those of you who know Chris know that you earned the compliments. Like he doesn't gush. So when he says it's working, you think it must be working. So, you know, he sent back some really great comments about my manuscript, and I thought, oh, well, it's not trash. Maybe I'll send it out. And it found a home soon after. So I feel like as I'm writing, I constantly think, and I think Chris's voice is always with me because I love his poetry. But I'm always thinking, one, I want to keep writing, and two, I want to make sure that I do the hard work to earn the okay, not just to get it done, but to really make it my best. And he must be somehow in my mind a lot, because I just shared my book with a group of older ladies that read poetry in my in the city next door, and I suggested they read Chris's after that, and they read them both, and they said, your collection and Chris's work, they mirror each other in so many ways. And that was sort of an out of body experience for me, because I thought, he's followed me. I've been gone from that program for over 15 years. And his voice is still with me. So it's been not only a motivator, but I think his writing and his voice has been a kind of a key component in my writing, as it turns out.
Thanks, that's great. So I have a question that's kind of for all four of you, about the process of after and maintaining that relationship. And we have a question from Kevin in our audience, whose question mirrors my own a little bit, so I'll try to combine them. So Kevin asks, what do you recommend to students concerned about no longer having the safety net of a mentor or thesis advisor after graduating from the program? How do you suggest they seek out and find an appropriate reader or mentor after graduation? Or what I would say and add to that is, if they want to continue, one thing I think I've heard from a lot of students before is, when you're in the process of the thesis advising, it's clear, you go to your advisor, you bring them work, you share with them. Afterwards, it might feel like a burden, or, well, I don't know, they have their own work, or they have thesis advisees now that aren't me. So how, if they want to find someone either outside of the program or continue a relationship with you, what would you recommend, both as the advisors and then for Sunni and Ashley as the advisees? How did you continue your relationship? So anyone, feel free to start here.
I mean, I would say I feel really lucky, like I sort of hit the jackpot, because Greg was that person for me that I continued to have a relationship with and really a friendship with. But yeah, that doesn't happen all the time. And I did grad school part 2. So I did go for my PhD after the MFA. And so I had a whole new community of fellow students there, and have kept reading for some of them, but also like summer workshops and programs on top of your academic work, like formerly Squaw Valley, now Community of Writers, I went to just a couple of years ago, and Greg was there, and that was where I met Casey, and now Casey and I exchange work. So there are other settings aside from, you know, traditional academic ones where you can make those sorts of connections and find people whose work speaks to you, and who get your work.
One of the things that I always tell people in the program is, I mean, it's really important. The classes are really important. Everything you learn in the seminars and workshops is really important. But the most valuable resource you walk away from an MFA program with is your connection with your peers, because that's the resource that you will use for the rest of your life. I mean, Jane Smiley and Richard Bausch still send each other their work because they were in a workshop together. I still send my work to Ann Williams, who was my peer like 30 years ago. Like, she's the first person I send stuff to, and that is just so valuable. And I think the important thing to remember about it is to just acknowledge that it is necessary. No one can really do this on their own. And there's this sort of illusion that, like, well, if I'm strong enough, then I don't really need readers. I don't need help. I should just be able to figure this out. But this is not true. You really do need people to read stuff. Samantha Chang once said to me, to be read is to be loved. And it's really that essential. And so it's important that you foster the connections with with your, the people in your cohort, you keep those connections alive. You make sure that you're respectful to each other. You make sure that you're prompt. And that, I mean, the worst thing you can do is not to be critical of your friend's work, but to just not respond. That's the worst thing you can do to someone who sends you their stuff, is just to never get back. And everyone's had that experience, and that person is kind of no longer going to be one of your network of readers, just period. It never will happen again. If they ignore you once, it doesn't happen again. And so that's a really critical thing, but being aware that it is necessary and acknowledging its necessity is like the critical thing. So like I remember when Ashley was considering going to a PhD program, I was like, absolutely, go do this, because it's going to give you that network and that support, and acknowledging that you need it is just, that's what you need. So do it. It's going to help you write more. And the same is true with like going to this community of writers or Port Townsend or any of these places. Like, just, it's not weakness, it's necessity. You really need readers, you need response, you need feedback, you need someone on the other end of the tunnel yelling back to you that they could make sense out of those words you put on the page, and then it makes it worthwhile. And so, yeah, I mean, it's just crucial, totally crucial. And I don't, it's true, like as far as like keeping in touch with your teacher, it's true that, we're pretty busy. Like, I mean, it's hard to just keep up with current students and reading admissions and everything else that's going on. So yeah, that stream does tend to kind of shut off when you're done, but not entirely. It's just it's less available. So I don't know. Yeah, that's my 2 cents.
I think too, from the other side of it, it's not just that you need a kind of community or a cohort. You need to be open, right? You need to be open to influence and learning, and a terrific source of that then would be that cohort, that group that you studied with, and essentially began to learn to be a writer with. It's not just about what they can provide you, but about a certain kind of posture that you yourself have toward learning. You kind of need to maintain. And it is true, I think, that the teachers, they have their own lives and their own writing and so forth, and maybe they can't always provide as much input as you might need, but I think if they're good teachers, they're going to remain at least open to some extent, in a way, I suppose, to keep encouraging the students to remain open and to consider all kinds of new vectors, that might influence their understanding of their own work. I don't know. It's the writing itself is a lifetime commitment, and the teaching, I think, probably is as well. I mean, I don't know how it is for other people, but that's kind of how I feel about it.
Yeah, I'll just add that I've had the good fortune of staying in touch with someone who wasn't in my initial cohort. She was a year younger than me, but Laura Stott and I both ended up in Ogden, Utah, and we both teach at Weber State. So we just started exchanging work, and it was just the two of us for quite a while. And then I felt like I could almost predict what Laura's comments were going to be. And I thought, gosh, it'd be kind of nice to have a third person in here to mix things up a little bit. So she had a friend that was looking for another writing group, and we invited her in. And one is so helpful to have a deadline, actually, to be accountable to someone. So we exchange 2 poems every month. And even if I think it's utter garbage, I turn it in. The other funny thing is that I think it's really helpful to have someone help you put things in context, or at least in perspective of how they're receiving it. Some work that I feel like is really strong of mine, they don't respond to the same way. And some of the stuff that I just wrote is, just to get the second poem, they'll say, this is the really good one. And I'll laugh because I'll think, how could you say this is the one I spent like half an hour on? But I think sometimes we work too hard in certain directions and we're not reaching the place we think we're reaching. And it's really helpful to have someone tell us that. Also, I just for fun, I thought I don't really know that much about form poetry as much as I would like. So I signed up for an online form class with Annie Finch, and it was really fun. Actually, we had a blast. On our little cohort in that, we're obviously nerds because we said, let's stay in touch. And every month we're going to get together on Zoom and we're going to scan poems and we're going to talk about how they're working and how they resonate with us. And we're going to move on to different forms. And so I agree, like if you have writers conferences or even online classes, we're in an episode right now where we're forced to do so much Zoom, but that means so much is at our fingertips and we can keep going through. I think it's helpful to find an area maybe where you feel like you're weak and find something that you maybe fills that, and just keep pursuing that so that you can keep crafting and using different tools in your work. There are a multitude of ways to do that.
And I just would also add that there's something really beautiful about that moment when you kind of confess your crush, like on someone's work that you've gotten to know in class or through a workshop. And really some of my fondest memories of both goes at grad school are from those moments when I approached someone or someone approached me or sent an email and said like, hey, I really love that piece you turned in, or, you know, I really love your work. And if you're up for it, I'd love to, you know, continue to exchange writing. And I don't know, there's something really intimate and lovely and like almost sexy about that is it's just a really good feeling and like a nice thing to do for someone else, and a nice thing to have someone, you know, approach you about.
Yeah, I think that all of you kind of touched on that idea of being open and vulnerable too, right? Asking someone to read your work and reading theirs, and what Chris said about being open to it, I think is really important. I met someone once at a wedding, a mutual friend's wedding. We did not know each other before. And we like drunkenly decided to exchange work at the end of that. And now we still, several years later, exchange work constantly. So it can happen anywhere. I have a question here from Luke, who's asking about what quality, specifically for Ashley and Sunny, when you're looking for choosing your advisor, what qualities or traits were you looking for? What did you think about when you wanted to work with Greg or Chris? What drew you to that?
I'll say I was thinking about maybe who I could tell had connected with my work. I felt like all of my professors were outstanding, but I felt like I got a good idea of who got where I was coming from, and who responded to my work in a way that I felt like would, one, affirm that, you know, that what I was doing was working on one level, but two, who would push me in a direction that would help me go beyond what I was doing. So Chris was the right fit for me for that. And like I said, I felt like he was someone that I could say anything to and I could talk to. And so I think that level of comfort was a big deal too, because once you get into that thesis, you get really vulnerable and you're putting so much of your time and your emotion in there. It helped to have someone that I felt like I could give them anything and they would give me an honest response.
Yeah, I think some of it is aesthetic compatibility and some of it is personal chemistry. And some of it is just like whose voice comes into my head when I'm writing or when I'm teaching too, which I didn't have as much experience at the time teaching creative writing workshops, but like even as a fellow student to my classmates, like whose words of wisdom came to me first when I was writing a critique or teaching a class. I just tend to remember a lot of things that Greg said. more so than some of my other instructors. So yeah.
To go back to an earlier question, it just occurs to me to say that I received a long letter today, an email from a friend that I met in my first MFA workshop in 1971, responding to one of my poems. You know, so this is a 50-year relationship, you know, that feels as fresh as a daisy, and that's really important to me. I think it should be important to writers just kind of generally.
Thank you, guys. This question from Claire, and I have a similar question. So she asked for Sunni and Ashley, did you have an idea of what you wanted your thesis to be, maybe thematically, before you started working with your advisor? Or how much was shaped by your conversations and working relationship with them? And kind of related to that for Greg and Chris, I wonder, when you're reading theses, are you working with the students with the idea of it being a collection or a whole, or is it more just about producing the work, honing the work that's in front of you, worry about how these pieces kind of fit together later?
Well, often the poetry theses are, they're kind of smorgasbords of poems. Frequently, they aren't driven by some kind of overall vision of kind of an underlying narrative or overarching, even linked sort of imagistic references. Often it's just a poem at a time, and you have to accept that, right? But if someone does have some kind of a underlying drive for a project like drive, then you try to keep them thinking about it with each increment of that as it comes up. You keep, you know, relating what they've done to what, you know, what they've done before, so that the implication is there's some kind of arc that they're following. I mean, this is a, you know, a fiction writer's sort of template, right? So I don't see it that often, but I do see it sometimes. And it's kind of up to the student what kind of advice they want, and, you know, combined with what kind of advice I feel they should have. So it's like that.
This kind of gets back to one of the things that Chris was talking about before, about the gap between what you intend to say and what you actually end up saying on the page. And honestly, most of the time when students show up in the fall and they have like a master plan for this collection that's going to be, you know, connected to X, Y, and Z, and it's going to do this thing and that thing, it's going to be all focused on whatever. I usually that's a sort of a warning signal to me that there's too much intentionality and not enough openness to, you know, just seeing what shows up on the page. And oftentimes the first thing is sort of like driving a wedge between those things, you know, before things get productive. Because if there's too much intentionality, there, you know, you just kind of freeze up, you become paralyzed, and you're writing to fit this sort of notion you had in advance that may end up being not really what you need to say. So that, I mean, and sometimes it works just fine. I mean, like, you know, someone shows up and they have a novel idea and they're just going to keep plugging away at it. But most of the time, the idea for the novel has to be shed, and then the novel itself has to find itself. And so that's a process. So usually when I hear someone show up with a sort of structure and outline and plan for everything, my first instinct is like, yeah, that's the first thing we're going to have to get rid of.
Yeah, I would say for me, there was a huge difference between producing a thesis and producing a book, which was something that didn't happen until almost nearly a decade after I was at Eastern. So I did, at the time that I was writing my MFA thesis, I did have a set of recurring characters who I was visiting in several different stories, just because I was interested in them and I loved them. And maybe I hoped that what I was working on might become a book, but none of those stories ended up in what actually did become my book. And I think, I don't know, I kind of think that's a good thing that I treated my thesis as a thesis and not as a book, because I think it allowed me to experiment more and try things. When I was at Eastern, I was kind of into magical realism, and I was incorporating these magical elements into my stories. And then in my PhD program, I got really interested in playing with point of view and doing kind of different, like riskier sorts of POV moves. And that was really rewarding because I was in a workshop or in a thesis environment where I had that captive audience and people who could give me feedback on these riskier things that I was trying and might have been afraid to do on my own. And so for me, I think it was more important to have this period of experimentation and risk taking and just figuring out what I cared about and what my voice was like as a writer. That was a more valuable use of my thesis time than trying to produce a book manuscript. It took me a long time to figure out, what my writing was actually like, and what my sort of philosophical and thematic obsessions were, that could eventually hold a book together. That process took a long time for me.
I would completely agree with that. Out of curiosity today, I looked at how many poems for my thesis actually made it into this first book, and there might be 2. So, I mean, I hope that's not discouraging to people. I feel like the most valuable thing is, though, I knew how to practice writing poetry, which is honestly why I got my MFA. I don't know that I got it to, I don't know if that I had any grand expectations other than I really just wanted to learn how to write poetry better. And I think keeping that in perspective was the most useful thing to me. And over time, I've learned how to pay attention to different things, and I've had life experiences that frankly I could draw from that were much deeper than I had in my early 20s. And so if I just kept going, then I knew that I would have plenty of material, and I had been practicing how to write about it. So I don't think for me, it wasn't so much the thesis. I was grateful that I finished it, but the fact is that I knew how to write through a book. And then I finally ended up with one that I felt like was a lot more reflective of what I wanted.
Thanks. This question from Emmett kind of it's been kind of answered a little bit in terms of Ashley and Sunny talking about what from their thesis made it into their books. But did you find any unexpected challenges trying to find a home for the work that you'd done in your thesis? Did you graduate and think immediately kind of send it out and think to agents or editors or different literary journals and find some kind of bias or push back against publishing somebody right out of an MFA or something that was fresh from our thesis?
I mean, I sent individual stories out and published a lot of them. So that was helpful to build up a publication record. While I didn't have a book, I did have, a number of published stories that I could kind of put on my resume. But yeah, I just would kind of echo what I said before, where for me, I really learned that I needed to be patient. And I think I would have been really disappointed if I had approached agents with at least my MFA thesis or the book that it consisted of. I think I would have been very discouraged because I don't think it was very good, because I was still learning what a story was. And so, I mean, I think it's good to know, like, when my collection became a book, like, I knew it, I knew it was done. And for many years prior to that, I think I wanted to have a book so badly that I did submit earlier drafts to like the Iowa Award and the George Flannery O'Connor Award and things like, you know, short story collection contests. And I never had any luck. And like, I knew why, because it wasn't done. I just wanted to have a book. But what I really had was sort of a greatest hits album, like a collection of stories that I'd written that I liked, but they weren't speaking to each other yet, or they weren't, you know, they didn't cohere in the way that I think a good story collection should. And so I don't know, I think like patience and listening to your own, like, how do you feel when you sit down and read your manuscript or your thesis? Do you feel like you just read a really good book? Or do you feel like you read several good stories? I think there's a difference there.
Yeah, it was really good for me actually. And the difference is when I was in the MFA program, I was reading the poetry of my cohorts, and then I was reading really established poets. And so after post MFA was really useful for me because I started reading more literary magazines and realizing more deeply what was being published. And so, yeah, I mean, I sent my stuff out and some of it got accepted, and that was great to celebrate, but the rejections were in some ways probably more useful because I could see, oh, this is maybe why it's not finding a home at this journal. It helped me get a little savvier about the sort of the aesthetic of different literary journals, and recognize where my work might fit, where it might not fit. So not to spend my time on that. And then to just be educated about what's being published now and practice sending stuff out, but also practice reading the books of the people that I was reading in the literary journals and getting just savvier about how to showcase my work. And so it turns out that rejection was actually really useful in the end.
A question a little bit off of this whole process of MFA, but Kate was wondering how the pandemic has changed everyone's lives and habits around their writing. Obviously, it's been kind of a crazy year, but especially for Sunni, who won a few awards this year. How did that come together in COVID, and what was that like? How has that been during this last crazy year?
I don't know that I was writing any more. I think I had more time to send work out, and maybe a little bit more time to fine tune a few things and to turn up the volume on how much I sent out. But I don't know. In my case, I have 3 kids and they were home for a little while doing the, virtual learning. So that was a small nightmare for a few months. But I think what's been useful for me is to make sure that I keep meeting with my writing group every month, and that whatever time I can find, I just keep writing. And I also just kind of got lucky last year.
Yeah, I don't know how much really changed for me. I did have, my book had come out in the fall 2019. And so I had about half of my book tour get canceled, which was really disappointing. And that was before we'd figured out we can just move things on Zoom. So they really were like, most of them were like canceled. And that was a bummer. But after a couple of months went by, I actually thought, well, it would be disappointing to have work come out, during the pandemic because you can't hold those in-person readings. But if I had it to do over, I would have swapped some of my in-person readings for Zoom events because more people could have been there. Like I did some readings in bookstores where like 4 people came, and that was kind of depressing. And so I think there's something really great about the accessibility of Zoom events. And like I would be excited to do those even after the pandemic is over, just so you can reach more people than you do, shoppers in a little books like indie bookstore at any given moment plus like whatever friends you have in that city. It's just a pretty small audience, whereas with the Zoom you can reach a lot larger audience.
I don't know that I have any particular insights about this, but I have been hearing that, like, I mean, I know that the book industry has been hit really hard. Kate can tell you festivals have been hit really hard, that, to kind of rebound from face to face to try to figure out how to do everything on a virtual platform and sell books all virtually is like, it's a huge challenge. And I know that a lot of presses and journals, publishers they're really, hitting some pretty hard times. And, on the one hand, on the other hand, it seems like what could make more sense than, like, everybody should want to read books now, right? Because you're stuck at home. But I'm not sure that's really translated to sales. So I don't have like the overview to say my book was sort of done 2019, came out, did what it was going to do, and I was pretty much done trying to give readings and events and whatnot. So I kind of dodged that, but like Ashley was saying, that was the normal thing. Like, go to a bookstore and there's two people there, kind of events that are like, well, that was great. So I don't know. Selling books is just it's a tough racket. I tell my music friends when they ask me, so how's writing? I say, well, it's a whole lot worse than music as far as trying to get out there and sell stuff. And they just laugh at me, but it's true.
Yeah, I had a book come out in late October 19, and it was just dead in the water in terms of kind of public comment. I had 2 reviews, which is sort of a violent reduction from previous publications. So that was something to contend with, the sense of silence, around this event. But get over that, you start working on the next book. You're already working on it anyway, so you go on, and I do think that, yeah, the virtual readings have kind of grown into place as a viable alternative to what we used to do. It took about 6 months for that to really happen. So I think that's good. And I also think that some of this will just continue when and if there's some kind of normalcy return to us. So maybe it will become part of the new normal, and maybe that's good, because it does really offer access that wasn't there before. So I'm over being depressed about it.
Yeah,
I
think.
Sorry,
Oh,
go
so
ahead.
I think it's helpful that that you learn to be flexible, and we were saying that earlier about your writing. But I think the way you introduce your book to the world, you have to be kind of flexible about that too. And I agree. My book came out August of 2019, and I was going to go to AWP and do all these readings, and my own publisher didn't even end up going to AWP, so I was kind of on my own, and we had to, some pressmates and I had to organize something, and so I feel like it forces you to be a little more proactive. The other thing though is that my chapbook that comes out in June, and initially I didn't realize it was going to be an e-chapbook. And I thought, well, do I accept this? Because I've never done an ebook before. I don't have any idea. But when I talked to a colleague, he said, you know what, we're all on Zoom anyway. I feel like this is probably a great time to do an ebook and not worry so much about sales, but just get more readers that way. Actually, it might be a terrific way to just sort of blast what you write out to people. So I feel like it's helpful to be flexible and to be open to different options. And if you need to switch gears to do that, because there are still readers, and people are still writing. It's just finding ways to do that. Also, I was really fortunate to find a Facebook group of women writers, and we promote each other's work. And so people say, I'll write a review of yours if you'll write a review of mine, or hey, my book's coming out if anyone wants to review it. So I think you have to find communities where you can just make things still happen because they're still going on.
Yeah, I mean, Zoom has allowed us to all come together when maybe we wouldn't have all been able to be in the same room in Spokane. And talking earlier about everyone's keeping in touch with your cohorts and your writing groups, it allows a chance for you to have a writing group of people who aren't in your city if you feel more isolated. And so I think it's been, if we can take some small thing from the last year, maybe that could be it and help our writing. I really want to thank everyone for being here today on our Zoom and making the time. It was really great to talk about all this with all of you. And thank you so much to Get Lit for hosting us and putting this event together.
Thank you. Thank you, Casey. Thank you so much for moderating that conversation and joining us here today. Thank you all at home for watching. Don't forget that you can learn more about these writers. You can learn more about the MFA program. You can learn more about the festival. And you can donate to support the festival by checking out our website, getlitfestival.org. And thank you all for being here. I hope you join us for more events. Bye, everybody.